Overview of Allport's psychology of the individual. Biography of Gordon Allport. Allport's approach to personality theory. What is personality? What is the role of conscious motivation? What are the characteristics of a healthy person? Structure of personality personal dispositions. Proprium. Motivation. A theory of motivation functional autonomy. The study of the individual morphogenic science. The diaries of Marion Taylor letters from Jenny. Related research. Understanding and reducing prejudice intrinsic and extrinsic religious orientation. Critique of Allport. Concept of humanity. Key terms and concepts. References. Page 379. In the fall of 1920, a 22-year-old American philosophy and economics student was visiting with an older brother in Vienna. During his visit, the young man penned a note to Sigmund Freud requesting an appointment. Freud, then the world's most famous psychiatrist, agreed to see the young man and suggested a specific time for a meeting. The young American arrived at number 19 Bergasse in plenty of time for his appointment with Dr. Freud. At the designated time, Freud opened the door to his consulting room and quietly ushered the young man inside. The American visitor suddenly realized that he had nothing to say. Searching his mind for some incident that might interest Freud, he remembered seeing a small boy on the tram car that day while traveling to Freud's home. The little boy, about 4 years old, displayed an obvious dirt phobia, constantly complaining to his well-starched mother about the filthy conditions on the car. Freud listened silently to the story and then, with a typical Freudian technique, asked his young visitor if he was in reality talking about himself. Feeling guilty, the young man managed to change the subject and to escape without too much further embarrassment. The American visitor to Freud's consulting room was Gordon Allport, and this encounter was the spark that ignited his interest in personality theory. Back in the United States, Allport began to wonder if there might be room for a third approach to personality, one that borrowed from traditional psychoanalysis and animal-driven learning theories, but also one that adopted a more humanistic stance. Allport quickly completed work for a PhD in psychology and embarked on a long and distinguished career as a staunch advocate for the study of the individual. Overview of Allport's psychology of the individual. More than any other personality theorist, Gordon Allport emphasized the uniqueness of the individual. He believed that attempts to describe people in terms of general traits rob them of their unique individuality. For this reason, Allport objected to trait and factor theories that tend to reduce individual behaviors to common traits. He insisted, for example, that one person's stubbornness is different from any other person's stubbornness, and the manner in which one person's stubbornness interacts with his or her extroversion and creativity is duplicated by no other individual. Consistent with Allport's emphasis on each person's uniqueness was his willingness to study in depth a single individual. He called the study of the individual morphogenic science and contrasted it with phenomothetic methods used by most other psychologists. Morphogenic methods are those that gather data on a single individual, whereas nomothetic methods gather data on groups of people. Allport also advocated an eclectic approach to theory building. He accepted some of the contributions of Freud, Maslow, Rogers, Eysenck, Skinner, and others, but he believed that no one of these theorists is able to adequately explain the total growing and unique personality. To Allport, a broad, comprehensive theory is preferable to a narrow, specific theory even if it does not generate as many testable hypotheses. Page 380. Allport argued against particularism, or theories that emphasize a single aspect of personality. In an important warning to other theorists, he cautioned them not to forget what you have decided to neglect. Allport, 1968, p. 2323. In other words, no theory is completely comprehensive, and psychologists should always realize that much of human nature is not included in any single theory. To Allport, a broad, comprehensive theory is preferable to a narrow, specific theory even if it does not generate as many testable hypotheses. Gordon Willard Allport was born on November 11, 1897, in Montezuma, Indiana, the fourth and youngest son of John E. Allport and Nellie Wise Allport. Allport's father had engaged in a number of business ventures before becoming a physician at about the time of Gordon's birth. Lacking adequate office and clinical facilities, Dr. Allport turned the household into a miniature hospital. Both patients and nurses were found in the home, and a clean, sterile atmosphere prevailed. Cleanliness of action was extended to cleanliness of thought. In his autobiography, Allport, 1967, wrote that his early life was marked by plain Protestant piety, pp. 44. Floyd Allport, his older brother by 7 years, who also became a famous psychologist, described their mother as a very pious woman who placed heavy emphasis on religion. F. Allport, 1974. As a former schoolteacher, she taught young Gordon the virtues of clean language and proper conduct, as well as the importance of searching for ultimate religious answers. By the time Gordon was 6 years old, the family had moved 3 times, finally settling in Cleveland, Ohio. Young Allport developed it. Early interest in philosophical and religious questions, and had more facility for words than for games. In fact, Allport was even bullied as a boy for being a human dictionary, Shostak and Friedman, 2008, p. 201201. He described himself as a social isolate who fashioned his own circle of activities. Although he graduated second in his high school class of 100, he did not consider himself an inspired scholar. Allport, 1967. In the fall of 1915, Allport entered Harvard, following in the footsteps of his brother Floyd, who had graduated 2 years earlier and who at that time was a graduate assistant in psychology. In his autobiography, Gordon Allport, 1967, wrote, "Almost overnight my world was remade. My basic moral values, to be sure, had been fashioned at home. What was new was the horizon of intellect and culture I was now invited to explore." pp. 55. His enrollment at Harvard also marked the beginning of a 50-year association with that university, which was only twice briefly interrupted. When he received his bachelor's degree in 1919 with a major in philosophy and economics, he was still uncertain about a future career. He had taken undergraduate courses in psychology and social ethics, and both disciplines had made a lasting impression on him. When he received an opportunity to teach in Turkey, he saw it as a chance to find out whether he would enjoy teaching. He spent the academic year, 1919. 1920 in Europe teaching English and sociology at Robert College in Istanbul. While in Turkey, Allport was offered a fellowship for graduate study at Harvard. He also received an invitation from his brother Fayette to stay with him in Vienna, where Fayette was working for the U.S. Trade Commission. In Vienna, Allport had the meeting with Sigmund Freud that we briefly described in the introduction to this chapter. This meeting with Freud greatly influenced Allport's later ideas on personality. With a certain audacity, the 22-year-old Allport wrote to Freud announcing that he was in Vienna and offered the father of psychoanalysis an opportunity to meet with him. The encounter proved to be a fortuitous, life-altering event for Allport. Not knowing what to talk about, the young visitor told Freud about seeing a small boy on the tram car earlier that day. The young child complained to his mother about the filthy conditions of the car and announced that he did not want to sit near passengers whom he deemed to be dirty. Allport claimed that he chose this particular incident to get Freud's reaction to a dirt phobia in a child so. Page 381. Young, but he was quite flabbergasted when Freud fixed his kindly therapeutic eyes upon me and said, "And was that little boy you?" Allport, 1967, p. 88. Allport said he felt guilty and quickly changed the topic. Allport told this story many times, seldom changing any words and never revealing the rest of his lone encounter with Freud. However, Alan Elms has uncovered Allport's written description of what happened next. After realizing that Freud was expecting a professional consultation, Allport then talked about his dislike of cooked raisins. I told him I thought it due to the fact that at the age of 3, a nurse had told me they were bugs. Freud asked, "When you recalled this episode, did your dislike vanish?" I said, "No." He replied, "Then you are not at the bottom of it." Elms, 1994, p. 7777. When Allport returned to the United States, he immediately enrolled in the PhD program at Harvard. After finishing his degree, he spent the following 2 years in Europe studying under the great German psychologists Max Wertheimer, Wolfgang Kohler, William Stern, Heinz Werner, and others in Berlin and Hamburg. In 1924, he returned again to Harvard to teach, among other classes, a new course in the psychology of personality. In his autobiography, Allport, 1967, suggested that this course was the first personality course offered in an American college. The course combined social ethics and the pursuit of goodness and morality with the scientific discipline of psychology. It also reflected Allport's strong personal dispositions of cleanliness and morality. 2 years after beginning his teaching career at Harvard, Allport took a position at Dartmouth College. For years later, he returned to Harvard and remained there for the rest of his professional career. In 1925, Allport married Ada Lufkin Gould, whom he had met when both were graduate students. Ada Allport, who received a master's degree in clinical psychology from Harvard, had the clinical training that her husband lacked. She was a valuable contributor to some of Gordon's work, especially his 2 extensive case studies, the case of Jenny Gove Masterson, discussed in the section titled The Study of the Individual, and the case of Marion Taylor, which was never published, Barenbaum, 1997. Thus sandwiched Allport between 2 generations of physicians, a fact that seemed to have pleased him in no small measure. Allport, 1967. Allport's awards and honors were many. In 1939, he was elected president of the American Psychological Association, APA. In 1963, he received the Gold Medal Award of the APA. In 1964, he was awarded the Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award of the APA, and in 1966, he was honored as the first Richard Clark Cabot Professor of Social Ethics at Harvard. On October 9, 1967, Allport, a heavy smoker, died of lung cancer. Page 382. Answers to 3 interrelated questions reveal Allport's approach to personality theory. 1. What is personality? 2. What is the role of conscious motivation in personality theory? 3. What are the characteristics of the psychologically healthy person? Few psychologists have been as painstaking and exhaustive as Allport in defining terms. His pursuit of a definition of personality is classic. He traced the etymology of the word persona back to early Greek roots, including the Old Latin and Etruscan meanings. As we saw in Chapter 11, the word personality probably comes from persona, which refers to the theatrical mask used in ancient Greek drama by Roman actors during the 1st and 2nd centuries BC. After tracing the history of the term, Allport spelled out 49 definitions of personality as used in theology, philosophy, law, sociology, and psychology. He then offered a 50th definition, which in 1937 was the dynamic organization within the individual of those psychophysical systems that determine his unique adjustments to his environment. Allport, 1937, p. 4848. In 1961, he had changed the last phrase to read, that determine his characteristic behavior and thought. Allport, 1961, p. 2828. The change was significant and reflected Allport's penchant for accuracy. By 1961, he realized that the phrase adjustments to his environment could imply that people merely adapt to their environment. In his later definition, Allport conveyed the idea that behavior is expressive as well as adaptive. People not only adjust to their environment, but also reflect on it and interact with it in such a way as to cause their environment to adjust to them. Allport chose each phrase of his definition carefully so that each word conveys precisely what he wanted to say. The term dynamic organization implies an integration or interrelatedness of the various aspects of personality. Personality is organized and patterned. However, the organization is always subject to change, hence the qualifier dynamic. Personality is not a static organization. It is constantly growing or changing. The term psychophysical emphasizes the importance of both the psychological and the physical aspects of personality. Another word in the definition that implies action is determine, which suggests that personality is something and does something. Allport, 1961, p. 2929. In other words, personality is not merely the mask we wear, nor is it simply behavior. It refers to the individual behind the facade, the person behind the action. By characteristic, Allport wished to imply individual or unique. The word character originally meant a marking or engraving, terms that give flavor to what Allport meant by characteristic. All persons stamp their unique mark or engraving on their personality and their characteristic behavior, and thoughts set them apart from all other people. Characteristics are marked with a unique engraving, a stamp or marking, that no one else can duplicate. The words behavior and thought simply refer to anything the person does. They are omnibus terms meant to include internal behaviors, thoughts, as well as external behaviors such as words and actions. Page 383. Allport's comprehensive definition of personality suggests that human beings are both product and process. People have some organized structure while, at the same time, they possess the capability of change. Pattern coexists with growth, order with diversification. In summary, personality is both physical and psychological. It includes both overt behaviors and covert thoughts. It not only is something, but it does something. Personality is both substance and change, both product and process, both structure and growth. More than any other personality theorist, Allport emphasized the importance of conscious motivation. Healthy adults are generally aware of what they are doing and their reasons for doing it. His emphasis on conscious motivation goes back to his meeting in Vienna with Freud and his emotional reaction to Freud's question, "And was that little boy you?" Freud's response carried the implication that his 22-year-old visitor was unconsciously talking about his own fetish for cleanliness in revealing the story of the clean little boy on the tram car. Allport, 1967, insisted that his motivation was quite conscious. He simply wanted to know Freud's ideas about dirt phobia in a child so young. Whereas Freud would assume an underlying unconscious meaning to the story of the little boy on the tram, Allport was inclined to accept self-reports at face value. This experience taught me that depth psychology, for all its merits, may plunge too deep, and that psychologists would do well to give full recognition to manifest motives before probing the unconscious. Allport, 1967, p. 88. However, Allport, 1961, did not ignore the existence or even the importance of unconscious processes. He recognized the fact that some motivation is driven by hidden impulses and sublimated drives. He believed, for example, that most compulsive behaviors are automatic repetitions, usually self-defeating and motivated by unconscious tendencies. They often originate in childhood and retain a childish flavor into adult years. What are the characteristics of a healthy person? Long before Abraham Maslow, see Chapter 99, made the concept of self-actualization popular, Gordon Allport, 1937, hypothesized in depth about the attributes of the mature personality. Allport's interest in the psychologically healthy person goes back to 1922, the year he finished his PhD. Not having any particular skills in mathematics, biology, medicine, or laboratory manipulations, Allport, 1967, was forced to find his own way in the humanistic pastures of psychology, pp. 88. Such pastures led to a study of the psychologically mature personality. A few general assumptions are required to understand Allport's conception of the mature personality. First, psychologically mature people are characterized by proactive behavior. That is, they not only react to external stimuli, but they are capable of consciously acting on their environment in new and innovative ways, and causing their environment to react to them. Proactive behavior is not merely directed at reducing tensions, but also at establishing new ones. Page 384. In addition, mature personalities are more likely than disturbed ones to be motivated by conscious processes, which allow them to be more flexible and autonomous than unhealthy people who remain dominated by unconscious motives that spring from childhood experiences. Healthy people ordinarily have experienced a relatively trauma-free childhood, even though their later years may be tempered by conflict and suffering. Psychologically healthy individuals are not without the foibles and idiosyncrasies that make them unique. Also, age is not a requisite for maturity, although healthy persons seem to become more mature as they get older. What, then, are the more specific requirements for psychological health? Allport, 1961, identified 6 criteria for the mature personality. The first is an extension of the sense of self. Mature people continually seek to identify with and participate in events outside themselves. They are not self-centered, but are able to become involved in problems and activities that are not centered on themselves. They develop an unselfish interest in work, play, and recreation. Social interest, Gemeinschaftsgefühl, family, and spiritual life are important to them. Eventually, these outside activities become part of one's being. Allport, 1961, summed up this first criterion by saying, "Everyone has self-love, but only self-extension is the earmark of maturity." pp. 285-285. Second, mature personalities are characterized by a warm relating of self to others. Allport, 1961, p. 285-285. They have the capacity to love others in an intimate and compassionate manner. Warm relating, of course, is dependent on people's ability to extend their sense of self. Only by looking beyond themselves can mature people love others non-possessively and unselfishly. Psychologically healthy individuals treat other people with respect, and they realize that the needs, desires, and hopes of others are not completely foreign to their own. In addition, they have a healthy sexual attitude and do not exploit others for personal gratification. A third criterion is emotional security or self-acceptance. Mature individuals accept themselves for what they are, and they possess what Allport, 1961, called emotional poise. These psychologically healthy people are not overly upset when things do not go as planned or when they are simply having a bad day. They do not dwell on minor irritations, and they recognize that frustrations and inconveniences are a part of living. Fourth, psychologically healthy people also possess a realistic perception of their environment. They do not live in a fantasy world or bend reality to fit their own wishes. They are problem-oriented rather than self-centered, and they are in touch with the world as most others see it. A fifth criterion is insight and humor. Mature people know themselves and, therefore, have no need to attribute their own mistakes and weaknesses to others. They also have a non-hostile sense of humor, which gives them the capacity to laugh at themselves rather than relying on sexual or aggressive themes to elicit laughter from others. Allport, 1961, believed that insight and humor are closely related and may be aspects of the same thing, namely self-objectification. Healthy individuals see themselves objectively. They are able to perceive the incongruities and absurdities in life and have no need to pretend or to put on airs. Page 385. The final criterion of maturity is a unifying philosophy of life. Healthy people have a clear view of the purpose of life. Without this view, their insight would be empty and barren, and their humor would be trivial and cynical. The unifying philosophy of life may or may not be religious, but Allport, 1954-1963, on a personal level, seem to have felt that a mature religious orientation is a crucial ingredient in the lives of most mature individuals. Although many church-going people have an immature religious philosophy and narrow racial and ethnic prejudices, deeply religious people are relatively free of these prejudices. The person with a mature religious attitude and a unifying philosophy of life has a well-developed conscience and, quite likely, a strong desire to serve others. The structure of personality refers to its basic units or building blocks. To Freud, the basic units were instincts. To Eysenck, see chapter 1414, they were biologically determined factors. To Allport, the most important structures are those that permit the description of the person in terms of individual characteristics, and he called these individual characteristics personal dispositions. Throughout most of his career, Allport was careful to distinguish between common traits and individual traits. Common traits are general characteristics held in common by many people. They can be inferred from factor analytic studies, such as those conducted by Eysenck and the authors of the five-factor trait theory, see chapter 1313, or they can be revealed by various personality inventories. Common traits provide the means by which people within a given culture can be compared to one another. Whereas common traits are important for studies that make comparisons among people, personal dispositions are of even greater importance because they permit researchers to study a single individual. Allport, 1961, defined a personal disposition as a generalized neuropsychic structure peculiar to the individual, with the capacity to render many stimuli functionally equivalent, and to initiate and guide consistent, equivalent, forms of adaptive and stylistic behavior. pp. 373373. The most important distinction between a personal disposition and a common trait is indicated by the parenthetical phrase, peculiar to the individual. Personal dispositions are individual. Common traits are shared by several people. Returning to his boy, Human Dictionary days, Allport and colleagues counted nearly 18,000, 17,953, to be exact, personally descriptive words in the 1925 edition of Webster's New International Dictionary about A. Fourth of which described personality characteristics, Allport and Odbert, 1936. Some of these terms, usually referred to as traits, describe relatively stable characteristics such as sociable or introverted. Others, usually referred to as states, describe temporary characteristics such as happy or angry. Others described evaluative characteristics such as unpleasant or wonderful, and still others referred to physical characteristics such as tall or obese. How many personal dispositions does one individual have? This question cannot be answered without reference to the degree of dominance that each personal disposition has in the individual's life. If we count those personal dispositions that are central to a person, then each person probably has 10 or fewer. However, if all tendencies are included, then each person may have hundreds of personal dispositions. Page 386. Levels of personal dispositions. Allport placed personal dispositions on a continuum from those that are most central to those that are of only peripheral importance to a person. Cardinal dispositions, some people possess an eminent characteristic or ruling passion so outstanding that it dominates their lives. Allport, 1961, called these personal dispositions cardinal dispositions. They are so obvious that they cannot be hidden. Nearly every action in a person's life revolves around this one cardinal disposition. Most people do not have a cardinal disposition, but those few people who do are often known by that single characteristic. Allport identified several historical people and fictional characters who possessed a disposition so outstanding that they have given our language a new word. Some examples of these cardinal dispositions include quixotic, chauvinistic, narcissistic, sadistic, a Don Juan, and so forth. Because cardinal dispositions are individual and are not shared with any other person, only Don Quixote was truly quixotic. Only Narcissus was completely narcissistic. Only the Marquis de Sade possessed the cardinal disposition of sadism. When these names are used to describe characteristics in others, they become common traits. Central dispositions few people have cardinal dispositions, but everyone has several central dispositions, which include the 5 to 10 most outstanding characteristics around which a person's life focuses. Allport, 1961, described central dispositions as those that would be listed in an accurate letter of recommendation written by someone who knew the person quite well. In the section titled The Study of the Individual, we will look at a series of letters written to Gordon and Ada Allport by a woman they called Jenny. The contents of these letters constitute a rich source of information about the writer. We will also see that 3 separate analyses of these letters revealed that Jenny could be described by about 8 central dispositions, that is, characteristics sufficiently strong to be detected by each of these 3 separate procedures. Similarly, most people, Allport believed, have 5 to 10 central dispositions that their friends and close acquaintances would agree are descriptive of that. Person. Secondary dispositions, less conspicuous, but far greater in number than central dispositions, are the secondary dispositions. Everyone has many secondary dispositions that are not central to the personality, yet occur with some regularity, and are responsible for much of one's specific behaviors. The 3 levels of personal dispositions are, of course, arbitrary points on a continuous scale from most appropriate to least appropriate. Cardinal dispositions, which are exceedingly prominent in a person, shade into central dispositions, which are less dominating but nevertheless mark the person as unique. Central dispositions, which guide much of a person's adaptive and stylistic behavior, blend into secondary dispositions, which are less descriptive of that individual. We cannot say, however, that one person's secondary dispositions are less intense than another person's central dispositions. Interperson comparisons are inappropriate to personal dispositions, and any attempt to make such comparison transforms the personal dispositions into common traits. Allport, 1961. Page 387. Motivational and stylistic dispositions. All personal dispositions are dynamic in the sense that they have motivational power. Nevertheless, some are much more strongly felt than others, and Allport called these intensely experienced dispositions motivational dispositions. These strongly felt dispositions receive their motivation from basic needs and drives. Allport, 1961, referred to personal dispositions that are less intensely experienced as stylistic dispositions, even though these dispositions possess some motivational power. Stylistic dispositions guide action, whereas motivational dispositions initiate action. An example of a stylistic disposition might be neat and impeccable personal appearance. People are motivated to dress because of a basic need to stay warm, but the manner in which they attire themselves is determined by their stylistic personal dispositions. Motivational dispositions are somewhat similar to Maslow's concept of coping behavior, whereas stylistic dispositions are similar to Maslow's idea of expressive behavior. See Chapter 99. Unlike Maslow, who drew a clear line between coping and expressive behaviors, Allport saw no distinct division between motivational and stylistic personal dispositions. Although some dispositions are clearly stylistic, others are obviously based on a strongly felt need and are thus motivational. Politeness, for example, is a stylistic disposition, whereas eating is more motivational. How people eat their style depends at least partially on how hungry they are, but it also depends on the strength of their stylistic dispositions. A usually polite but hungry person may forego manners while eating alone, but if the politeness disposition is strong enough and if others are present, then the famished person may eat with etiquette and courtesy despite being famished. Whether motivational or stylistic, some personal dispositions are close to the core of personality, whereas others are more on the periphery. Those that are at the center of personality are experienced by the person as being an important part of self. They are characteristics that an individual refers to in such terms as "that is me" or "this is mine." All characteristics that are peculiarly mine belong to the proprium. Allport, 1955. Allport used the term proprium to refer to those behaviors and characteristics that people regard as warm, central, and important in their lives. The proprium is not the whole personality, because many characteristics and behaviors of a person are not warm and central. Rather, they exist on the periphery of personality. These non-propriate behaviors include 1. Basic drives and needs that are ordinarily met and satisfied without much difficulty. 2. Tribal customs such as wearing clothes, saying hello to people, and driving on the right side of the road. And 3. Habitual behaviors such as smoking or brushing one's teeth that are performed automatically and that are not crucial to the person's sense of self. As the warm center of personality, the proprium includes those aspects of life that a person regards as important to a sense of self-identity and self-enhancement. Allport, 1955. The proprium includes a person's values as well as that part of the conscience that is personal and consistent with one's adult beliefs. A generalized conscience, one shared by most people within a given culture, may be only peripheral to a person's sense of personhood and thus outside that person's proprium. Page 388. Most people, Allport believed, are motivated by present drives rather than by past events, and are aware of what they are doing, and have some understanding of why they are doing it. He also contended that theories of motivation must consider the differences between peripheral motives and propriate strivings. Peripheral motives are those that reduce a need, whereas propriate strivings seek to maintain tension and disequilibrium. Adult behavior is both reactive and proactive, and an adequate theory of motivation must be able to explain both. Allport believed that a useful theory of personality rests on the assumption that people not only react to their environment, but also shape their environment and cause it to react to them. Personality is a growing system, allowing new elements to constantly enter into and change the person. Many older theories of personality, Allport, 1960, believed, did not allow for possibilities of growth. Psychoanalysis and the various learning theories are basically homeostatic or reactive theories because they see people as being motivated primarily by needs to reduce tension and to return to a state of equilibrium. Sometimes people are motivated to seek tension, not merely reduce it. Pure stock/super stock. An adequate theory of personality, Allport contended, must allow for proactive behavior. It must view people as consciously acting on their environment in a manner that permits growth towards psychological health. A comprehensive theory must not only include an explanation of reactive theories, but also include those proactive theories that stress change and growth. In other words, Allport argued for a psychology that, on one hand, studies behavioral patterns and general laws, the subject matter of traditional psychology, and on the other, growth and individuality. Page 389. Allport claimed that theories of unchanging motives are incomplete because they are limited to an explanation of reactive behavior. The mature person, however, is not motivated merely to seek pleasure and reduce pain, but to acquire new systems of motivation that are functionally independent from their original motives. The concept of functional autonomy represents Allport's most distinctive and, at the same time, most controversial postulate. It is Allport's 1961 explanation for the myriad human motives that seemingly are not accounted for by hedonistic or drive reduction principles. Functional autonomy represents a theory of changing rather than unchanging motives and is the capstone of Allport's ideas on motivation. In general, the concept of functional autonomy holds that some, but not all, human motives are functionally independent from the original motive responsible for the behavior. If a motive is functionally autonomous, It is the explanation for behavior, and one need not look beyond it for hidden or primary causes. In other words, if hoarding money is a functionally autonomous motive, then the miser's behavior is not traceable to childhood experiences with toilet training or with rewards and punishments. Rather, the miser simply likes money, and this is the only explanation necessary. This notion that much human behavior is based on present interests and on conscious preferences is in harmony with the common sense belief of many people who hold that they do things simply because they like to do them. Functional autonomy is a reaction to what Allport called theories of unchanging motives, namely Freud's pleasure principle and the drive reduction hypothesis of stimulus response psychology. Allport held that both theories are concerned with historical facts rather than functional facts. He believed that adult motives are built primarily on conscious, self-sustaining, contemporary systems. Functional autonomy represents his attempt to explain these conscious, self-sustaining, contemporary motivations. Admitting that some motivations are unconscious and others are the result of drive reduction, Allport contended that, because some behavior is functionally autonomous, theories of unchanging motives are inadequate. He listed 4 requirements of an adequate theory of motivation. Functional autonomy, of course, meets each criterion. 1. An adequate theory of motivation will acknowledge the contemporaneity of motives. In other words, whatever moves us must move now. Allport, 1961, p. 220220. The past per se is unimportant. The history of an individual is significant only when it has a present effect on motivation. 2. It will be a pluralistic theory, allowing for motives of many types. Allport, 1961, p. 221221. On this point, Allport was critical of Freud and his two-instinct theory, Adler, and the single striving for success, and all theories that emphasize self-actualization as the ultimate motive. Allport was emphatically opposed to reducing all human motivation to one master drive. He contended that adults' motives are basically different from those of children, and that the motivations of neurotic individuals are not the same as those of normal people. In addition, some motivations are conscious, others unconscious. Some are transient, others recurring. Some are peripheral, others propitiate, and some are tension-reducing, others tension-maintaining. Motives that appear to be different really are different, not only in form, but also in substance. Page 390. 3. It will ascribe dynamic force to cognitive processes, e.g., to planning and intention. Allport, 1961, p. 222222. Allport argued that most people are busy living their lives into the future, but that many psychological theories are busy tracing these lives backward into the past. And while it seems to each of us that we are spontaneously active, many psychologists are telling us that we are only reactive, pp. 206206. Although intention is involved in all motivation, this third requirement refers more generally to long-range intention. A young woman declines an offer to see a movie because she prefers to study anatomy. This preference is consistent with her purpose of making good grades at college and relates to her plans of being admitted to medical school, which is necessary in order for her to fulfill her intention of being a doctor. The lives of healthy adults are future-oriented, involving preferences, purposes, plans, and intentions. These processes, of course, are not always completely rational, as when people allow their anger to dominate their plans and intentions. 4. An adequate theory of motivation is one that will allow for the concrete uniqueness of motives. Allport, 1961, p. 225225. A concrete unique motive is different from an abstract generalized one, the latter being based on a pre-existent theory rather than the actual motivation of a real person. An example of a concrete unique motive is Derek, who is interested in improving his bowling game. His motive is concrete. and his manner of seeking improvement is unique to him. Some theories of motivation may ascribe Derek's behavior to an aggressive need, others to an inhibited sexual drive, and still others to a secondary drive learned on the basis of a primary drive. Allport would simply say that Derek wants to improve his bowling game because he wants to improve his bowling game. This is Derek's unique, concrete, and functionally autonomous motive. In summary, a functionally autonomous motive is contemporary and self-sustaining. It grows out of an earlier motive but is functionally independent of it. Allport, 1961, defined functional autonomy as any acquired system of motivation in which the tensions involved are not of the same kind as the antecedent tensions from which the acquired system developed, pp. 229229. In other words, what begins as one motive may grow into a new one that is historically continuous with the original but functionally autonomous from it. For example, a person may originally plant a garden to satisfy a hunger drive but eventually become interested in gardening for its own sake. Perseverative functional autonomy. The more elementary of the two levels of functional autonomy is perseverative functional autonomy. Allport borrowed this term from the word perseveration, which is the tendency of an impression to leave an influence on subsequent experience. Perseverative functional autonomy is found in animals as well as humans, and is based on simple neurological principles. An example of perseverative functional autonomy is a rat that has learned to run a maze in order to be fed, but then continues to run the maze even after it has become satiated. Why does it continue to run? Allport would say that the rat runs the maze just for the fun of it. Page 391. Allport, 1961, listed other examples of perseverative functional autonomy that involve human rather than animal motivation. The first is an addiction to alcohol, tobacco, or other drugs when there is no physiological hunger for them. Alcoholics continue to drink although their current motivation is functionally independent from their original motive. Another example concerns uncompleted tasks. A problem once started but then interrupted will perseverate, creating a new tension to finish the task. This new tension is different from the initial motivation. For example, a college student is offered 10 cents for every piece of a 500-piece jigsaw puzzle she successfully puts together. Assume that she does not have a pre-existing interest in solving jigsaw puzzles and that her original motivation was solely for the money. Also assume that her monetary reward is limited to $45, so that after she has completed 450 pieces, she will have maximized her pay. Will this student finish the remaining 50 pieces in the absence of monetary reward? If she does, then a new tension has been created, and her motive to complete the task is functionally autonomous from the original motive of getting paid. Procreate functional autonomy. The master system of motivation that confers unity on personality is procreate functional autonomy, which refers to those self-sustaining motives that are related to the proprium. Jigsaw puzzles and alcohol are seldom regarded as peculiarly mine. They are not part of the proprium, but exist only on the periphery of personality. On the other hand, occupations, hobbies, and interests are closer to the core of personality, and many of our motivations concerning them become functionally autonomous. For example, a woman may originally take a job because she needs money. At first, the work is uninteresting, perhaps even distasteful. As the years pass, however, she develops a consuming passion for the job itself, spending some vacation time at work, and perhaps even developing a hobby that is closely related to her occupation. A person might begin running to lose weight, but continue because running is enjoyable. The motive for continuing to run is then functionally autonomous from the motive for beginning to run. Pure stock / super stock. In general, a present motive is functionally autonomous to the extent that it seeks new goals, meaning that the behavior will continue even as the motivation for it changes. For example, a child first learning to walk is motivated by some maturational drive, but later he may walk to increase mobility or to build self-confidence. Similarly, A scientist initially dedicated to finding answers to difficult problems may eventually gain more satisfaction from the search than from the solution. At that point, her motivation becomes functionally independent from her original motive of finding answers. She may then look for another area of inquiry, even though the new field is somewhat different from the previous one. New problems may lead her to seek new goals and to set higher levels of aspiration. Page 392. Functional autonomy is not an explanation for all human motivation. Allport, 1961, listed 8 processes that are not functionally autonomous. 1. Biological drives, such as eating, breathing, and sleeping. 2. Motives directly linked to the reduction of basic drives. 3. Reflex actions, such as an eye blink. 4. Constitutional equipment, namely physique, intelligence, and temperament. 5. Habits in the process of being formed. 6. Patterns of behavior that require primary reinforcement. 7. Sublimations that can be tied to childhood sexual desires. And 8. Some neurotic or pathological symptoms. The 8th process, neurotic or pathological symptoms, may or may not involve functionally autonomous motives. For an example of a compulsive symptom that was not functionally autonomous, Allport, 1961, offered the case of a 12-year-old girl who had a disturbing habit of smacking her lips several times a minute. This habit had begun about 8 years earlier, when the girl's mother told her that when she inhaled it was good air, and when she exhaled it was bad air. Because the girl believed that she had made the air bad by bringing it out, she decided to kiss it to make it well. As her habit continued, she repressed the reason for her compulsion and continued kissing the bad air, a behavior that took the form of smacking her lips. This behavior was not functionally autonomous, but the result of a compulsive need to keep good air from becoming bad air. Allport suggested a criterion for differentiating between a functionally autonomous compulsion and one that is not. For example, compulsions that can be eliminated through therapy or behavior modification are not functionally autonomous, whereas those that are extremely resistant to therapy are self-sustaining and thus functionally autonomous. When therapy allowed the 12-year-old girl to discover the reason for her habit, she was able to stop smacking her lips. On the other hand, some pathological symptoms serve a contemporary lifestyle and are functionally autonomous from earlier experiences that instigated the pathology. For example, a second-born child's attempts to overtake his older brother may change into a compulsive lifestyle, one marked by unconscious strivings to overtake or defeat all rivals. Because such a deep-seated neurosis is probably not amenable to therapy, it meets Allport's criterion for being functionally autonomous. Because psychology has historically dealt with general laws and characteristics that people have in common, Allport repeatedly advocated the development and the use of research methods that study the individual. To balance the predominant normative or group approach, he suggested that psychologists employ methods that study the motivational and stylistic behaviors of one person. Early in his writings, Allport distinguished between 2 scientific approaches: the nomothetic, which seeks general laws, and ideographic, which refers to that which is peculiar to the single case. Because the term ideographic was so often misused, misunderstood, and misspelled, being confused with ideographic, or the representation of ideas by graphic symbols, Allport, 1968, abandoned the term in his later writings and spoke of morphogenic procedures. Both ideographic and morphogenic pertain to the individual, but ideographic does not suggest structure or pattern. In contrast, morphogenic refers to pattern properties of the whole organism and allows for intraperson comparisons. The pattern or structure of one's personal dispositions is important. For example, Tyrone may be intelligent, introverted, and strongly motivated by achievement needs, but the unique manner in which his intelligence is related to his. Introversion and each of his achievement needs forms a structured pattern. These individual patterns are the subject matter of morphogenic science. Page 393. What are the methods of morphogenic psychology? Allport, 1962, listed many. some completely morphogenic, some partly so. Examples of wholly morphogenic first-person methods are verbatim recordings, interviews, dreams, confessions, diaries, letters, some questionnaires, expressive documents, projective documents, literary works, art forms, automatic writings, doodles, handshakes, voice patterns, body gestures, handwriting, gait, and autobiographies. When Allport met Hans Eysenck, the famous British factor analyst and believer in nomothetic science, see chapter 1414, he told Eysenck that one day he, Eysenck, would write his autobiography. Eventually, Eysenck, 1997b, did indeed publish an autobiography in which he admitted that Allport was right and that morphogenic methods such as one's description of one's own life and work can have validity. Semi-morphogenic approaches include self-rating scales, such as the adjective checklist, standardized tests in which people are compared to themselves rather than a norm group, the Allport, Vernon, Lindsay study of values, 1960, and the Q-sort technique of Stevenson, 1953, which we discussed in chapter 1010. Consistent with common sense, but contrary to many psychologists, Allport was willing to accept at face value the self-disclosure statements of most participants in a study. A psychologist who wishes to learn the personal dynamics of people needs simply to ask them what they think of themselves. Answers to direct questions should be accepted as valid unless the person is a young child, psychotic, or extremely defensive. Allport, 1962, said that too often we fail to consult the richest of all sources of data, namely, the subject's own self-knowledge, pp. 413413. During the late 1930s, Allport and his wife, Ada, became acquainted with an extremely rich source of personal data about a woman whom they called Marion Taylor. The core of this data was nearly a lifetime of diaries, but personal information on Marion Taylor also included descriptions of her by her mother, her younger sister, her favorite teacher, 2 of her friends, and a neighbor, as well as notes in a baby book, school records, scores on several psychological tests, autobiographical material, and 2 personal meetings with Ada Allport. Nicole Berenbaum, 1997, has put together a brief account of Marion Taylor's life. Taylor was born in 1902 in Illinois, moved to California with her parents and younger sister in 1908, and began writing to her diary in 1911. Soon after her 13th birthday, her diary entries became more personal, including fantasies and secret feelings. She eventually graduated from college, earned a master's degree, and became a psychology and biology teacher. She married at page 394. Age 31, but had no children. Although a wealth of personal documents on Marion Taylor became available to Ada and Gordon Allport, the Allports chose not to publish an account of her story. Berenbaum, 1997, offered some possible reasons for this, but due to major gaps in the correspondence between Marion Taylor and Ada Allport, it is now impossible to know for certain why the Allports did not publish this case history. Their work with Marion Taylor probably helped them organize and publish a second case, the story of Jenny Gove Masterson, another pseudonym. Allport's morphogenic approach to the study of lives is best illustrated in his famous letters from Jenny. These letters reveal the story of an older woman and her intense love/hate feelings toward her son, Ross. Between March 1926, when she was 58, and October 1937, when she died, Jenny wrote a series of 301 letters to Ross's former college roommate, Glenn, and his wife, Isabel, who almost certainly were Gordon and Ada Allport, winter, 1993. Allport originally published parts of these letters anonymous, 1946, and then later published them in more detail under his own name, Allport, 1965. Born in Ireland of Protestant parents in 1868, Jenny was the oldest in a family of 7 children that included 5 sisters and a brother. When she was 5 years old, the family moved to Canada, and when she was 18, her father died, and Jenny was forced to quit school and go to work to help support her family. After 9 years, her brothers and sisters became self-supporting, and Jenny, who had always been considered rebellious, scandalized her family by marrying a divorced man, a decision that further alienated her from her conservatively religious family. After only 2 years of marriage, Jenny's husband died. A month or so later, her son, Ross, was born. This was 1897, the same year Gordon Allport, Ross's future college roommate, was born. The next 17 years were somewhat contented ones for Jenny. Her world revolved around her son, and she worked hard to ensure that he had everything he wanted. She told Ross that, aside from art, the world was a miserable place, and that it was her duty to sacrifice for him because she was responsible for his existence. When Ross moved away to attend college, Jenny continued to scrimp in order to pay all his bills. As Ross began to be interested in women, the idyllic mother-son relationship came to an end. The two quarreled often and bitterly over his female friends. Jenny referred to each of them as prostitutes or whores, including the woman Ross married. With that marriage, Jenny and Ross became temporarily estranged. At about that same time, Jenny began an 111/2-year correspondence with Glenn and Isabel, Gordon and Ada, in which she revealed much about both her life and her personality. The early letters showed that she was deeply concerned with money, death, and Ross. She felt that Ross was ungrateful and that he had abandoned her for another woman, and a prostitute at that. She continued her bitterness toward him until he and his wife were divorced. She then moved into the apartment next to Ross's, and for a short time Jenny was happy. But soon Ross was seeing other women, and Jenny inevitably found something wrong with each other. Her letters were filled again with animosity for Ross, suspicious and cynical attitude toward others, and a morbid yet dramatic approach to life. 3 years into the correspondence, Ross suddenly died. After his death, Jenny's letters expressed a somewhat more favorable attitude toward her son. Now she did not have to share him with anyone. Now he was safe, no more prostitutes. For the next 8 years, Jenny continued writing to Glenn and Isabel, and they usually answered her. However, they served mostly as neutral listeners and not as advisors or confidants. Jenny continued to be overly concerned with death and money. She increasingly blamed others for her misery and intensified her suspicions and hostility toward her caregivers. After Jenny died, Isabel, Ada, commented that, in the end, Jenny was the same, only more so. Allport, 1965. P156156. These letters represent an unusually rich source of morphogenic material. For years, they were subjected to close analysis and study by Allport and his students, who sought to build the structure of a single personality by identifying personal dispositions that were central to that person. Allport and his students used 3 techniques to look at Jenny's personality. First, Alfred Baldwin, 1942, developed a technique called personal structure analysis to analyze approximately 1/3 of the letters. To analyze Jenny's personal structure, Baldwin used 2 strictly morphogenic procedures, frequency and contiguity, for gathering evidence. The first simply involves a notation of the frequency with which an item appears in the case material. For example, how often did Jenny mention Ross, or money, or herself? Contiguity refers to the proximity of 2 items in the letters. How often did the category Ross, unfavorable, occur in close correspondence with herself, self-sacrificing? Freud and other psychoanalysts intuitively used this technique of contiguity to discover an association between 2 items in a patient's unconscious mind. Baldwin, however, refined it by determining statistically those correspondences that occur more frequently than could be expected by chance alone. Using the personal structure analysis, Baldwin identified 3 clusters of categories in Jenny's letters. The first related to Ross, women, the past, and herself self-sacrificing. The second dealt with Jenny's search for a job, and the third cluster revolved around her attitude toward money and death. The 3 clusters are independent of each other, even though a single topic, such as money, may appear in all 3 clusters. Second, Jeffrey Page, 1966, used a factor analysis to extract primary personal dispositions revealed by Jenny's letters. In all, Page identified 8 factors: aggression, possessiveness, affiliation, autonomy, familial acceptance, sexuality, sentience, and martyrdom. Page's study is interesting because he identified 8 factors, a number that corresponds very well with the number of central dispositions, 5 to 10, that Allport had earlier hypothesized would be found in most people. The third method of studying Jenny's letters was a common-sense technique used by Allport, 1965. His results are quite similar to those of Baldwin and Page. Allport asked 36 judges to list what they thought were Jenny's essential characteristics. They recorded 198 descriptive adjectives, many of which were synonymous and overlapping. Allport then grouped the terms into 8 clusters. 1. Quarrelsome suspicious. 2. Self-centered possessive. 3. Independent autonomous. 4. Dramatic intense. 5. Aesthetic artistic. 6. Aggressive. 7. Cynical morbid. And 8. Sentimental. Comparing this common-sense clinical approach with Page's factorial. Study, Allport, 1966, presented some interesting parallels. See Table 12.1. Through Jenny's letters, then, we find that she possessed about 8 central traits that characterized the last 12 years of her life, if not her entire life. She was aggressive, suspicious, possessive, aesthetic, sentimental, morbid, dramatic, and self-centered. These central dispositions were sufficiently powerful that she was described in similar terms both by Isabel, Ada Allport, who knew her well, and by independent researchers who studied her letters. Allport, 1965. Page 396. Table 12.1. Jenny's central dispositions revealed by clinical and factor analytic techniques. Clinical technique, Allport. Quarrelsome and suspicious. Aggressive. Self-centered, possessive. Sentimental. Independent autonomous. Aesthetic artistic. Self-centered, self-pitying. Factor analytic technique, Page. Aggression. Possessiveness. Need for affiliation. Need for family acceptance. Need for autonomy. Sentience. Martyrdom. No parallel. Cynical morbid. Dramatic intense. Sexuality. No parallel. Overstate. That is, the tendency to be dramatic and to overstate her concerns. The close agreement between Allport's common-sense clinical approach and Page's factor analytic method does not prove the validity of either. It does, however, indicate the feasibility of morphogenic studies. Psychologists can analyze one person and identify central dispositions with consistency even when they use different procedures. More than any other personality theorist, Gordon Allport maintained a lifelong active interest in the scientific study of religion and published 6 lectures on the subject under the title The Individual and His Religion, Allport, 1950. On a personal level, Allport was a devout Episcopalian, and for nearly 30 years, he offered a series of meditations in Appleton Chapel, Harvard University, Allport, 1978. Allport was interested in prejudice, and developing ways to reduce racial prejudice was of the utmost importance to him. Allport, 1954, proposed that one of the most important components to reducing prejudice was contact. If members of majority and minority groups interacted more under optimal conditions, there would be less prejudice. This became known as the contact hypothesis, and the optimal conditions were relatively simple. 1. Equal status between the two groups. 2. Common goals. 3. Cooperation between groups. And 4. Support of an authority figure, law, or custom. For example, if African American and European American neighbors got together to form a neighborhood watch group with a common goal of making their. Page 397. Neighborhood safer, and such a program was endorsed by the mayor or city police department. Then this interaction and group effort would be likely to lead to reduced prejudice among residents of the neighborhood. The best way to decrease conflict and prejudice is to have more contact and interaction with those different from us. Moxie Productions / Blend Images, LLC. Although Allport himself conducted some research on the topic of prejudice reduction, Allport, 1954, one of his students, Thomas Pettigrew, has continued the work that Allport began. Pettigrew and Trop, 2006. Pettigrew et al., 2011. Trop and Pettigrew, 2005. Thomas Pettigrew and Linda Trop have built a large research program targeted at investigating the conditions under which contact between groups can reduce prejudice. In 2 complex meta-analyses of over 500 studies and more than 250,000 participants, Pettigrew and Trop, 2006, and Pettigrew et al., 2011, examined the validity of Allport's contact hypothesis. They found that, indeed, intergroup contact reduces prejudice, and that Allport's 4 conditions for optimal contact between groups facilitate this effect. Furthermore, although the concept of optimal contact was originally conceptualized as a way to reduce racial prejudice, Allport, 1954, research has shown that it also works to reduce prejudiced attitudes toward other stigmatized groups such as the elderly, disabled, mentally ill, and gay and lesbian individuals. Pettigrew et al., 2011. Studies generally show larger effects for measures of liking than for such indicators as stereotyping, meaning that optimal contact helps us like the outgroup more even while stereotypes about them may persist. Trop and Pettigrew, 2005. Page 398. One fascinating discovery from all these years of research on optimal contact is the special importance of cross-group friendship in reducing prejudice. As Pettigrew et al., 2011, point out, friendship involves extended contact across a variety of settings, and this facilitates strong, positive attitudes toward the outgroup that are resistant to change. One particularly moving study conducted in Northern Ireland illustrates this power of friendship. In it, friendships between Catholics and Protestants engendered both trust and forgiveness of the other religious group, and this effect was the strongest among those who had suffered directly from the religious violence in the area. Houstone, Cairns, Voci, Hamburger, and Miens, 2006. Some of the studies included in Thomas Pettigrew and Linda Trop's reviews, 2006, 2011, involved relatively simple methods of merely asking people how many friends they have who are of a minority group, a measure of contact, and then having them complete various self-report measures designed to capture the extent to which participants endorse stereotypical views of minority groups. Other studies included in the review, however, involved a more complex methodology whereby participants were randomly assigned to either groups that involved optimal contact with members of a minority group as prescribed by Allport or groups that did not involve the optimal contact prescribed by Allport. Although both types of studies found that optimal contact reduces prejudice, the experiments in which people were randomly assigned to engage in optimal contact or not showed the strongest reduction in prejudice. Pettigrew and Trop, 2006. Of course, there is no reason such. Optimal contact must take place in a laboratory, and Pettigrew and Trop's 2006 findings demonstrate the great potential for community programs to be developed based on Allport's prescription for prejudice reduction. If such programs were implemented, research shows that relations between majority and minority groups would likely be greatly improved. More recently, Pettigrew and his colleague Anthony Greenwald and Pettigrew, 2014, reviewed research on a heretofore under-examined feature of prejudice that Allport, 1954, also posited. We often assume a direct connection between prejudice and discrimination. Indeed, most definitions of prejudice explicitly connect it to negative evaluation and/or treatment of outgroups. However, in his book The Nature of Prejudice, Allport, 1954, argued that this connection between prejudicial attitudes and discriminatory behavior is an empirical one, not one to be assumed. Much discrimination, Allport hypothesized, might actually be accomplished by in-group favoritism, not outright hostility toward outgroups. Greenwald and Pettigrew, 2014, reviewed compelling evidence from a variety of different areas of study within psychology and sociology, supporting the rather surprising claim that indeed discrimination does not require hostility, and that unequal treatment is in fact more. Easily produced by in-group members' bias toward helping one another, than by their hurting members of a disadvantaged outgroup. One exemplary research finding, among many, that shows this effect is the minimal group paradigm, which was first discovered 40 years ago, Tachful, 1970. Since its discovery, many studies have demonstrated that people are more motivated by in-group favoritism, even when the group they belong to is utterly arbitrary, than by the desire to punish or disfavor an outgroup. Conformity is another empirically validated contributor to this in-group favoritism finding, and it was posited by Allport, 1962, as well. Sociologists have long studied norms, and studies show that unprejudiced people typically follow their in-group's norms. If these norms are characterized by preferential treatment of the in-group, most members will conform, even in the absence of any bad feelings toward the outgroup, e.g., witness the racial segregation of a typical public high school cafeteria. In other words, discrimination can be accomplished, Greenwald and Pettigrew, 2014, argue via a decidedly unremarkable process that involves little, if any, outright hostility. For this reason, we must not only pass laws against hostile discrimination, but also provide societal constraints against the many forms of subtle in-group favoritism that end up giving more advantages to the already advantaged, and, over time, generating discrimination against them. Page 399. Disadvantaged. As Pettigrew and colleagues, 2011, point out, popular opinion on contact between groups is quite split. Some believe that good fences make good neighbors. That is, intergroup contact only causes conflict, so we're best sticking to our own. But decades of work on in-group favoritism show that doing so will only exacerbate racial imbalances and discrimination, because when we're only sticking to our own, we're likely to conform to the norms of our own, at the expense of others. Allport believed that intergroup interaction is essential to reduce prejudice and conflict between groups. Decades of research by his students have resolved this disagreement and shown that Allport was right. The only way to decrease conflict and prejudice is to interact with those we consider to be different. Overall, Gordon Allport was an immensely insightful personality psychologist whose ideas continue to inspire psychologists today. Although his ideas undoubtedly continue to enrich research in personality psychology, his proposals about understanding prejudice and methods for reducing prejudice have quietly enriched the lives of people who have, perhaps unknowingly, benefited from his deep commitment to reducing prejudice in our society. Allport believed that a deep religious commitment was a mark of a mature individual, but he also believed that not all churchgoers have a mature religious orientation. Some, in fact, are highly prejudiced. Allport, 1966, offered a possible explanation for this frequently reported observation. He suggested that church and prejudice offer the same safety, security, and status, at least for some people. These people can feel both comfortable and self-righteous with their prejudicial attitudes and their church attendance. To understand the relationship between church attendance and prejudice, Allport and J. Michael Ross, 1967, developed the Religious Orientation Scale, ROS, which is applicable only for churchgoers. The ROS consists of 20 items, 11 extrinsic and 9 intrinsic. Examples of extrinsic items are: the primary purpose of prayer is to gain relief and protection. What religion offers me most is comfort when sorrow and misfortune strike. And one reason for my being a church member is that such membership helps to establish a person in the community. Examples of intrinsic items include: my religious beliefs are what really lie behind my whole approach to life, and I try hard to carry my religion over into all my other dealings in life. PP 436436. Allport and Ross assumed that people with an extrinsic orientation have a utilitarian view of religion. That is, they see it as a means to an end. Theirs is a self-serving religion of comfort and social convention. Their beliefs are lightly held and easily reshaped when convenient. In contrast, a second group of people have an intrinsic orientation. These people live their religion and find their master motive in their religious faith. Rather than using religion for some end, they bring other needs into harmony with their religious values. They have an internalized creed and follow it fully. The publication of Allport and Ross's 1967, ROS spawned a tremendous research literature on these two different motivations for religion and their relationship to both mental and physical health. Page 400. Religious motivation and mental health. Forgiveness is often thought of as a religious virtue having no place in non-denominational psychotherapy, but empirical psychologists have begun to study this emotionally laden process, clarifying what it is and what it is not, and discovering its positive association with mental health, e.g., Worthington, Whitfliet, Pietrini, and Miller, 2007. Empirical approaches to forgiveness define this process as occurring within an individual, i.e., the forgiven need not know they are forgiven, and involving a positive attitude change toward a transgressor or particular transgression. Furthermore, generally speaking, clinical psychology has taken a jaundiced view of religious faith as part of a mentally healthy personality, but Allport's framework on religious motivation, as opposed to simply religiosity per se, provides some interesting ways for mental health professionals to work with their clients' religious faith or spirituality during therapy. Bergen, 1980. One recent study explored whether intrinsic versus extrinsic religiosity influences individuals' conceptualizations of forgiveness and their attitudes toward forgiveness as a therapeutic intervention. Seedall and Butler, 2014. Over 300 participants completed a survey that assessed their intrinsic versus extrinsic motivations for religion using a variation of the ROS. These participants were then randomly assigned to read one of 3 harm scenarios that might be addressed in either couples or family therapy: domestic violence, sexual affair, or sexual abuse. Participants then rated their understanding of forgiveness and also rated how acceptable they found a forgiveness therapeutic treatment in the context of the harm scenario. The researchers hypothesized that intrinsically religious people would be more likely than the extrinsically religious to accept forgiveness as a therapeutic treatment and less likely to endorse misconceptions about the nature of forgiveness. One of these common misconceptions is assuming that forgiveness represents pardoning or condoning harm. It does not. Seedall and Butler, 2014, found that, as hypothesized, intrinsically religious participants were significantly more accepting of forgiveness in therapy than extrinsically religious participants were. Furthermore, as predicted, intrinsic religiosity predicted fewer misconceptions regarding forgiveness, and this may be why individuals who approach religion with a more intrinsic than extrinsic motivation are more prepared to accept forgiveness as a strategy in therapy. This suggests that couples and family therapists working with religious clients might do well to determine the religious motivations of these clients in order to best facilitate mentally healthy forgiveness work in therapy. Those who are more extrinsically religious may need to have the personal benefits of forgiveness spelled out for them in order that they not foreclose on this potentially healing experience due to misconceptions about it. It seems that both forgiveness and a more intrinsically motivated approach to religion are both associated with greater mental health. extending allport's religious motivation to other religions. Most simply put, the motive to be religious connects religious acts to goals. Intrinsic religiosity occurs when religious acts are ends in themselves, and extrinsic religiosity is when they are done as a means to an end. One limitation of Allport and Ross' measure of intrinsic and extrinsic religious orientation scale, ROS, is its starting and ending point is one religion, Christianity. The question, page 401, therefore becomes, is Allport and Ross's model applicable to other religions? Since the 2000s, researchers have attempted to answer this question, especially as it might apply to Islamic religion. Among the first to expand Allport's theory of religious motivation to Muslims was Nima Gorbani and colleagues, 2002. Gorbani, Watson, Garibi, and Chen, 2018. Gorbani, Watson, Tabaz, and Chen, 2017. And Watson et al., 2002. Gorbani and colleagues, 2002, developed a new scale, the Muslim Christian Religious Orientation Scales, MCROS, that was not only geared to Muslim and Christian belief systems, but it also expanded the definition and measurement of extrinsic religiosity. Inspired by and expanding Kirkpatrick's 1989 findings with the ROS, Gorbani and colleagues developed a total of 8 subscales of extrinsic religiosity by first distinguishing this worldly from otherworldly religious activities. This worldly activities occur on earth, and otherworldly ones occur in an afterlife. Moreover, this worldly was further divided into 3 effects: personal P, social S, and cultural C, and 2 outcomes, positive P and negative N. This leads to 6 external this-worldly scales: personal positive, PP, personal negative, PN, social positive, SB, social negative, SN, cultural positive, CP, and cultural negative, CN. See Table 12.2 for sample items. Table 12.2. Example items from the Muslim Christian Religious Orientation Scales, MCROS. Gorbani et al., 2002. Scale. Intrinsic. Sample item. In my religious life, I always seek closeness to God. It is essential that I spend time reading the Quran, Bible, so that I can hear what God has to say to me. Extrinsic. This worldly. Personal positive. Personal negative. Social positive. Social negative. Cultural positive. Cultural negative. Otherworldly. Positive. Negative. I read the Quran, Bible, because it makes me feel good about myself. An awareness of my own personal inadequacies is a main reason why I need God. A principal reason behind my religion is to make new friends and acquaintances. I am religious in order not to have a bad reputation among others. My motivation for being religious is a desire to develop a human society that is peaceful, just, and happy. I am religious because I know that the loss of religious life leads to the decline of civilization and culture. I am religious because I want to spend eternity in heaven. I do my best to avoid sin because I do not want to go to hell. Gorbani and colleagues, 2002, validated the new measure by also administering the allport Ross ROS to a group of U.S/Christian N equals 188 and Iranian/Muslim N equals 187 university students. Additionally, all participants completed various measures of psychological outcomes such as anxiety, depression, obsession, compulsion, and interpersonal sensitivity. They found that the questions on the rocks were internally consistent and reliable in both the U.S. and Iranian samples. Moreover, the new scales in general were positively correlated with the ROI intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity scales of Allport and Ross. But this was not always the case. In fact, Most MCROS extrinsic scales were positively correlated with ROS intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity. This result counters Allport's theory that intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity are polar opposites. Moreover, in general terms, extrinsic religiosity as measured by the MROC was positively correlated with psychological maladjustment, anxiety, depression, obsessive compulsive disorder in the Iranian but not the American sample. Finally, the new MCROS suggests that extrinsic religiosity can have positive mental outcomes, such as when the external this worldly cultural positive scale correlated negatively with depression in the Iranian sample. Recall that scale consisted of items such as, I am religious because I want to spend eternity in heaven, suggesting that people who endorsed those kinds of questions were less depressed than those who did not. Other researchers have used modified measures of the allport Ross ROS scale in studying the connection between religiosity and psychological health outcomes in Muslim students, but 2014. The modified ROI is known as the Age Universal IE scale, Maltby 1999, and consists of 6 questions for intrinsic orientation, 3 for extrinsic personal, and 3 for extrinsic social. But 2014 also administered measures of psychological health, depression, anxiety, positive and negative mood, and well-being to a sample of 209 Pakistani Muslim students, but also found support for the idea that intrinsic religiosity is negatively related to anxiety and positively related to well-being and positive mood, but found no association between intrinsic religiosity and depression. Extrinsic religiosity was negatively related to psychological well-being and positive mood, but positively with anxiety, meaning those with high extrinsic scores are low. In well-being and positive mood, but high in anxiety, in some allports. Model of religiosity is finding intriguing support when applied to Islamic samples, but it is also clear that the pattern of psychological outcomes differs somewhat compared to Christian samples. Page 402. Allport based his theory of personality more on philosophical speculation and common sense than on scientific investigation. He never intended his theory to be completely new or comprehensive, but rather he was eclectic, carefully borrowing from older theories and recognizing that his detractors could have important things to say. Consistent with this tolerant attitude, Allport, 1968, acknowledged that his adversaries may have been at least partially right. To Allport, most people are best thought of as conscious, forward-looking, tension-seeking individuals. To people who believe that deterministic theories have lost sight of the proactive person, Allport's view of humanity is philosophically refreshing. As with any other theory, however, it must be evaluated on a scientific basis. Page 403. Allport probably did more than any other psychologist to define personality and to categorize other definitions of the term. But do his writings constitute a theory in the sense of stating a set of related assumptions that generate testable hypotheses? On this criterion, Allport's exhortations rate a qualified yes. It is a limited theory, offering explanations for a fairly narrow scope of personality, namely certain kinds of motivation. The functionally autonomous motives of psychologically healthy adults are covered quite adequately by Allport's theory. But what are the motives of children and of mentally disturbed adults? What moves them and why? What about ordinarily healthy adults who uncharacteristically behave in a strange manner? What accounts for these inconsistencies? What explanation did Allport offer for the bizarre dreams, fantasies, and hallucinations of mature individuals? Unfortunately, his account of personality is not broad enough to adequately answer these questions. Despite its limitations as a useful theory, Allport's approach to personality is both stimulating and enlightening. Anyone interested in building a theory of personality should first become familiar with Allport's writings. Few other psychologists have made as much effort to place personality theory in perspective. Few have been as careful in defining terms, in categorizing previous definitions, or in questioning what units should be employed in personality theory. The work of Allport has set a standard for clear thinking and precision that future theorists would do well to emulate. Has the theory generated research? On this criterion, Allport's theory receives a moderate rating. His religious orientation scale, his study of values, and his interest in prejudice have led to multiple studies on the scientific study of religion, values, and prejudice. On the criterion of falsifiability, Allport's theory must receive a low rating. The concept of four somewhat independent religious orientations can be verified or falsified, but most of Allport's other insights lie beyond the ability of science to determine whether some other explanation might be equally appropriate. A useful theory provides an organization for observations. Does Allport's theory meet this criterion? Again, only for a narrow range of adult motives does the theory offer a meaningful organization for observations. Much of what is known about human personality cannot be easily integrated into Allport's theory. Specifically, behaviors motivated by unconscious forces, as well as those that are stimulated by primary drives, were not adequately explained by Allport. He recognized the existence of these kinds of motivations, but seemed content to allow the psychoanalytic and behavioral explanations to stand without further elaboration. This limitation, however, does not invalidate Allport's theory. To accept the validity of other theoretical concepts is a legitimate approach to theory building. As a guide for the practitioner, Allport's theory has moderate usefulness. It certainly serves as a beacon to the teacher and the therapist, illuminating the view of personality that suggests that people should be treated as individuals. The details, unfortunately, are left unspecified. On the final two criteria of a useful theory, Allport's psychology of the individual is highly rated. His precise language renders the theory both internally consistent and parsimonious. Page 404. Allport had a basically optimistic and hopeful view of human nature. He rejected the psychoanalytic and behavioral views of humanity as being too deterministic and too mechanistic. He believed that our fates and our traits are not determined by unconscious motives originating in early childhood, but by conscious choices we make in the present. We are not simply automatons blindly reacting to the forces of reward and punishment. Instead, we are able to interact with our environment and make it reactive to us. We not only seek to reduce tensions, but to establish new ones. We desire both change and challenge, and we are active, purposive, and flexible. Because people have the potential to learn a variety of responses in many situations, psychological growth can take place at any age. Personality is not established in early childhood, even though for some people infantile influences remain strong. Early childhood experiences are important only to the extent that they exist in the present. Although early security and love leave lasting marks, children need more than love. They need an opportunity to shape their own existence creatively, to resist conformity, and to be free, self-directed individuals. Although society has some power to mold personality, Allport believes that it does not hold the answer to the nature of humanity. The factors shaping personality, Allport held, are not as important as personality itself. Heredity, environment, and the nature of the organism are important, but people are essentially proactive and free to follow the prevailing dictates of society or to chart their own life course. People, however, are not completely free. Allport, 1961, adopted a limited freedom approach. He was often critical of those views that allow for absolute freedom, but he also opposed the psychoanalytic and behavioral views, which he regarded as denying free will. Allport's position was somewhere in the middle. Although free will exists, some people are more capable of making choices than are others. A healthy person has more freedom than does a child or a severely disturbed adult. The high intelligent, reflective person has more capacity for free choice than does the low intelligent, non-reflective one. Even though freedom is limited, Allport maintained that it can be expanded. The more self-insight a person develops, the greater that person's freedom of choice. The more objective a person becomes, that is, The more the blindfolds of self-concern and egotism are removed, the greater that person's degree of freedom. Education and knowledge also expand the amount of freedom we have. The greater our knowledge is of a particular arena, the broader our freedom in that area. To have a broad general education means that, to some extent, one has a wider choice of jobs, recreational activities, reading materials, and friends. Page 405. Finally, our freedom can be expanded by our mode of choosing. If we stubbornly adhere to a familiar course of action simply because it is more comfortable, our freedom remains largely restricted. Conversely, if we adopt an open-minded mode of solving problems, then we broaden our perspective and increase our alternatives. That is, we expand our freedom to choose. Allport, 1955. Allport's view of humanity is more teleological than causal. Personality, to some extent, is influenced by past experiences, but the behaviors that make us human are those that are motivated by our expectations of the future. In other words, we are healthy individuals to the extent that we set and seek future purposes and aspirations. Each of us is different from others, not so much because we have different basic drives, but because we have different self-erected goals and intentions. The growth of personality always takes place within a social setting, but Allport placed only moderate emphasis on social factors. He recognized the importance of environmental influences in helping to shape personality, but he insisted that personality has some life of its own. Culture can influence our language, morals, values, fashions, and so forth, but how each of us reacts to cultural forces depends on our unique personality and our basic motivation. In summary, Allport held an optimistic view of humanity, maintaining that people have at least limited freedom. Human beings are goal-oriented, proactive, and motivated by a variety of forces, most of which are within their realm of consciousness. Early childhood experiences are of relatively minor importance and are significant only to the extent that they exist in the present. Both differences and similarities among people are important, but individual differences and uniqueness receive far greater emphasis in Allport psychology. Allport was eclectic in his acceptance of ideas from a variety of sources. He defined personality as the dynamic organization within the individual of those psychophysical systems that determine a person's behavior and thought. Psychologically healthy people are motivated largely by conscious processes, have an extended sense of self, relate warmly to others, accept themselves for who they are, have a realistic perception of the world, and possess insight, humor, and a unifying philosophy of life. Allport advocated a proactive position, one that emphasized the notion that people have a large measure of conscious control over their lives. Common traits are general characteristics held in common by many people. They may be useful for comparing one group of people with another. Page 406. Individual traits, personal dispositions, are peculiar to the individual and have the capacity to render different stimuli functionally equivalent and to initiate and guide behavior. Three levels of personal dispositions are: 1. Cardinal dispositions, which only a few people possess, and which are so conspicuous that they cannot be hidden. 2. Central dispositions, the 5 to 10 individual traits that make a person unique. And 3. Secondary dispositions, which are less distinguishable but far more numerous than central dispositions. Personal dispositions that initiate actions are called motivational traits. Personal dispositions that guide actions are called stylistic traits. The proprium refers to those behaviors and personal dispositions that are warm and central to our lives and that we regard as peculiarly our own. Functional autonomy refers to motives that are self-sustaining and independent from the motives that were originally responsible for a behavior. Perseverative functional autonomy refers to those habits and behaviors that are not part of one's proprium. Propriate functional autonomy includes all those self-sustaining motivations that are related to the proprium. Allport used morphogenic procedures, such as diaries and letters, which stress patterns of behavior within a single individual. Allport F, 1974. An autobiography in G. Lindsay ed. A History of Psychology in Autobiography, Volume 6, pages 1 to 1. Englewood Cliffs, N.J., Prentice Hall. Allport G. W., 1937. Personality, A Psychological Interpretation. New York, Henry Holt.
Allport GW, 1950 rok.
The Individual and His Religion. New York, Macmillan. Allport G. W., 1954. The Nature of Prejudice. Reading M.A. Addison. Wesley. Allport G. W., 1955. Becoming. Basic Consideration for a Psychology of Personality. New Haven, CT, Yale University Press. Allport G. W., 1960. The Open System in Personality Theory. Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology, 61, 301 to 310. Allport G. W., 1961. Pattern and Growth in Personality. New York, Holt, Reinhardt, and Winston. Allport G. W., 1962. The General and the Unique in Psychological Science. Journal of Personality, 30, 405 to 422. Allport G. W., 1963. Behavioral Science, Religion and Mental Health. Journal of Religion and Health, 2, 187 to 197. Allport G. W., 1965. Letters from Jenny. San Diego, Harcourt Brace Jovanovich. Allport G. W., 1966. Traits Revisited. American Psychologist, 21, 1 to 10. Allport G. W., 1967. An Autobiography in E.G. Boring and G. Lindsay, eds. A History of Psychology in Autobiography, Volume 5, pages 1 to 1. New York, Appleton Century Cross. Allport G. W., 1968. The Person in Psychology, Boston, Beacon Press.